Have you ever seen those famous Habsburg portraits with their weird long faces and giant chins? They're more disturbing than you might think. Those exaggerated features weren't just artistic choices. They were physical traits that got progressively worse over generations in one of history's most inbred royal families. This was the Habsburg dynasty that ruled large parts of Europe for nearly 700 years from the 15th to early 20th centuries. At their peak, they controlled Spain, Austria, Hungary, and the Holy Roman Empire. But underneath the fancy titles and wealth lay a dark secret. Their obsession with preserving a pure bloodline led to one of the most bizarre examples of inbreeding in history. Habsburg men and women regularly married their first cousins. Uncles married their nieces, cousins married their double first cousins. You get the picture? By the late 1700s, 80% of Habsburg children were born from the union of first cousins. It was so common for them to marry within the family that there is almost no record of a Habsburg child being born to unrelated parents over a span of many generations. This created an extremely tight family tree, with lots of intertwining branches. And like any good tree, the Habsburgs believed their roots were pure and holy. But instead of nourishing their branches, they interbred until their blood ran to water. You see, the Habsburgs came from a small group of survivors. When the Black Death ravaged Europe in the 1340s, killing millions, Habsburg rulers saw this massive die-off as an opportunity to expand their power. So they married up with other small surviving noble houses to consolidate their wealth and land. But by limiting their gene pool so drastically, they unknowingly doomed their bloodline to genetic disaster. What makes the Habsburg story especially compelling is that their physical deterioration was not gradual or subtle. One of the most noticeable results of their inbreeding was a distinctive feature called the Habsburg jaw or mandibular prognathism. Children were born with large, square jaws that stuck out, protruding lower lips and elongated pointy noses. By the late 1600s, their skulls were shaped like a heart, with a protruding occipital ridge on the back of their heads. The family also suffered from oversized tongues, which caused speech impediments, difficulty chewing and swallowing, and constant drooling. Other common traits included missing teeth, receding gums, misaligned bites, and cleft palates. Perhaps the most extreme and tragic example of these deformities was Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king. Charles wasn't born with a silver spoon. He was born with a silver platter. What would become known as Charles the Dull's syndrome began when his dad, Philip III, married his first cousin, Anne of Austria. The couple had 3 children, 2 of whom died in infancy. Then came Charles. 2 years after his birth, his parents and 4 of his siblings died within a few months of each other in a horrible influenza pandemic. So at age 24, Charles found himself King of Spain, Holy Roman Emperor, and ruler of huge parts of Italy and the Netherlands. But the boy king wasn't all there. Due to his inbreeding, Charles had an inbreeding coefficient of 6.7, higher even than full siblings. That's like having 6.7 copies of the same DNA instead of 2. With that kind of genetic cocktail, it's no surprise Charles was unfit for the throne. He couldn't speak clearly, walk properly, or father offspring. He had violent mood swings, epileptic seizures, and terrible stomach problems. In fact, Charles couldn't eat solid food for most of his life. Doctors resorted to grinding his meals into a liquid consistency. No wonder he weighed only 45 pounds as an adult. Despite his incapacities, Charles remained king for 76 years, until his death in 1700. He spent most of his days in a custom-made straitjacket to keep him from hurting himself. His attendants spoon-fed him and cleaned his diapers. Ironically, given his own struggles, Charles fathered 9 children, none of whom survived infancy. His youngest son, Don Jose, shared his horrible prognathic jaw, which caused him to choke to death on his own saliva at age 13, with Charles unable to produce heirs. The Spanish Habsburg line ended with him, marking the end of the dynasty in Spain. Like Charles, many Habsburg men struggled to rule effectively due to their ailments. But it's important to remember that their wives and daughters suffered too. Though we may focus on Charles II because he was the most extreme example, he wasn't alone. For centuries, Habsburg women were forced into marriages with their close relatives, often at a very young age. These women experienced painful pregnancies, miscarriages, and early deaths. They were essentially breeders for the dynasty. It's estimated that over the course of 200 years, the Habsburgs had around 300 marriages between first cousins and 60 between uncle and niece. They were so obsessed with keeping their blood pure that they didn't care if it meant their children had horrible deformities, or if it killed them. That's why Habsburg portraits, once thought to be flattering royal propaganda, are now considered chilling records of their deformities. When you look closely at the paintings, you can see the Habsburgs knew something was wrong with them. They weren't trying to hide their ailments. Most likely, they believed their illnesses were divinely ordained and part of God's plan for them. After all, the Habsburgs considered themselves the chosen people, the anointed descendants of biblical figures like Abraham and David. They really believed their bloodline was superior and special. The absurdity of the situation is that as the family grew weaker and more sick, they became more convinced of their divine mission. By the late 1600s, the Habsburgs had become so inbred that many couldn't even hold a conversation without lapsing into gibberish. The family language was peppered with neologisms, words that sounded like gibberish to outsiders, but were perfectly understandable to the Habsburgs. They lived in a world completely disconnected from reality, surrounded by their own jargon and incomprehensible speech patterns. It's a fascinating aspect of their story, highlighting how the family became imprisoned by their own bloodline. The irony is that while they imagined themselves as godlike rulers, the Habsburgs were actually biologically regressing faster than any other people. Over 400 years, they went from being powerful monarchs to being physically and mentally disabled recluses. So what was it that made the Habsburgs so determined to marry within their tiny family pool? Part of it had to do with their immense wealth and power. The Habsburgs were the richest and most influential family in Europe for several centuries. They had so much money and land that they didn't need to look outside their family to find suitable spouses for their children. Plus, since they believed their bloodline was blessed by God, why would they want to dilute their pure blood by marrying outsiders? Of course, the Habsburgs weren't alone in their desire to maintain a pure bloodline. Inbreeding was common among European royals, who believed it helped keep their blood royal. But the Habsburgs took things to extremes. Their system of marriage and inheritance ensured that their bloodline stayed as inbred as possible. They strictly followed the Salic law, which stated that only males could inherit their lands and titles. This meant that females could never become queens regnant, meaning they couldn't pass their bloodline down through legitimate heirs. For the Habsburgs, women were nothing more than vessels to carry on their bloodline. They married them off to their male relatives to keep their blood pure, but never allowed them to exercise any real power. The result was a slow-motion train wreck. As the Habsburg jaw and other deformities grew worse over the generations, the family's political influence waned. By the late 1700s, they had lost much of their power and prestige. Eventually, the Habsburg dynasty collapsed entirely. Though there are still people alive today who carry the Habsburg bloodline, many have undergone medical procedures to correct lingering genetic issues from generations of inbreeding. The Habsburg story is one of the most cautionary tales in history. It shows what happens when a family becomes too big for its britches, when power and tradition overcome biology and common sense. It also serves as a reminder that our genes don't care about our status or beliefs. No matter how wealthy, powerful, or divinely inspired you think you are, the laws of genetics will always apply. The Habsburgs may have started out as relative innocents, but their insistence on marrying within their family turned them into victims of their own bloodline. Their tragic fate reminds us that sometimes our deepest flaws can be inherited, both physically and metaphorically. Thank you for watching.